Hi everyone, welcome to the environment and breast cancer. We'll get started in just a couple of minutes. Dr. McDonald, you can go ahead and share your screen.
Okay.
Perfect. Thank you. So we'll just give people another minute or so to sign on and then we'll begin.
Okay.
So welcome everyone to the environment and breast cancer, what we know about risk and prevention. I'm Christine Benjamin, the Breast Cancer Program Director at SHARE. And before the presentation begins, I'd like to tell you just a little bit about SHARE. SHARE is a nonprofit organization that has been helping people through breast and ovarian cancer for the last 42 years by offering the support of those who've been there. SHARE offers many services, including a helpline, telephone and in-person support groups, and educational programs. All services are free of charge. For more information, visit our website, sharecancersupport.org. All participants will be muted during the presentation. When the presenter finishes speaking, we'll open up for a Q&A session. You are welcome to submit questions during the presentation through the question pane in the control panel on your screen. When asking questions, please remember the presenter is unable to give specific medical advice, so please keep your questions general in nature. This webinar is being recorded and will be available soon on the SHARE website. So I'd like to introduce our speaker. Dr. Jasmine McDonald received her PhD in Biological Sciences and Public Health from Harvard University. She is currently an assistant professor of epidemiology at the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University, as well as the co-director of the CURE program at the Herbert Irving Comprehensive Cancer Center. Upon completion of her doctoral degree, Dr. McDonald sought to cultivate a multidisciplinary frame of public health research focused on high cancer risk populations. She completed a postdoctoral fellowship where she focused on socio-behavioral factors and environmental exposures within populations with high breast cancer risk. Please welcome Dr. McDonald. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it, and I hope that I can educate the audience a little bit. So I'm just going to jump right in. So she gave you pretty much a bit of my background. So to start, we're going to really talk about risk and prevention about breast cancer. So, I did not mean to do that. So let's first start off with the epidemiology of breast cancer. So as many of you on this call know, breast cancer is the most commonly diagnosed cancer in women in the US and most of the world region. 30% of all estimated new cancer cases in females in 2018 are projected to be breast cancer. But this is not just a highly prevalent disease within the States. This is a global issue. The global breast cancer incidence has increased from 1980 to 2010 and at an annual rate of 3.1%. And this is actually considered an epidemic as it relates to cancer. If you look at the map here, these are representing the most common cancer sites across the globe. And you can see that breast cancer is the most common cancer site pretty much everywhere in the world. In fact, breast cancer is not just an older age disease. 1/3 of all global breast cancer cases are diagnosed under age 50 years, as represented in the pie chart in the orange. And what also is known, and people are studying right now, is the notion of pregnancy-related breast cancer, as it is definitely established that pregnancy and your first birth and the age at first birth is associated with a long-term protection against breast cancer. But there also is a transient increased risk of breast cancer for every pregnancy. And even for women who are developing breast cancer now, even without a family history, we have to start thinking about the next generation, as these women's children will now have a family history of cancer. And in general, we say that the lifetime risk of breast cancer for women living in the US, the average is 12.4%. And this is captured in a 1 in 8 will be diagnosed with cancer of the breast during their lifetime. But knowing that, how do we prevent cancer? Well, first, to understand prevention, you have to really understand how cancer is caused. And I like showing this figure, as this is a way to think about navigating breast cancer prevention by understanding the different levels that are associated with causing breast cancer. Commonly, we focus on the genes or the biology, but we also need to think about the social factors that are associated with increasing our risk of breast cancer. So, of course, we have the inherited genes such as BRCA mutations. We have the somatic genome, as well as biological factors such as mammographic breast density. But we also have those individual behaviors such as smoking, alcohol intake. But we can't forget the physical and social environment that we live in. For example, is one able to walk in their neighborhood as a form of physical fitness if they feel unsafe in their neighborhood, which is the physical environment? And then, of course, we have the health policy environment, which in the media, you've seen a lot about sweet and sugary beverage policies. And so these all contribute to increasing our risk of developing breast cancer. It contributes to the levels of carcinogenesis from initiation to promotion to progression to metastasis, but it also impacts our ability to intervene. So when we're thinking about this, we have to think of it across the life course, because breast cancer is something that has a very long latency period, which means that it's a disease that occurs after a very long period of time. And so when we really think about intervening, we have to think about it from as early as possible to as late. So we think of intervening across based off of 3 levels of prevention: primary prevention, secondary prevention, as well as tertiary prevention. So primary prevention is primarily considered where you target the healthy populations. So these populations, you're not considering them for at risk per se. You're promoting healthy behaviors, and you're identifying factors that protect and are deleterious for breast cancer. Secondary prevention is when you're actually identifying people who are at risk for the health problem. So this is considering the populations that should be screened in order to detect early diagnosis. And then you have tertiary prevention, and this is when you actually are targeting people with these particular health problems. So these are people with breast cancer, and you're looking at the treatment, rehabilitation, and improving quality of life. But today what we're going to focus on is primary prevention. But we're going to look at primary prevention as it relates to those who have not been diagnosed with breast cancer, but those who have been diagnosed with breast cancer. What are some prevention methods that one can use to improve breast cancer outcomes? So in general, there's a lot of guidelines out there for how to improve survivorship after breast cancer. And the American Institute for Cancer Research has focused on 10 cancer prevention recommendations: maintaining a healthy weight, being physically active and eating well, and having a nutritious diet, such as a plant-based diet, and less salt, and reducing red meats and avoiding processed meats, but also cutting down alcohol, and cutting out smoking or chewing tobacco completely. And there's also the suggestion that we don't use supplements for cancer prevention. And if you can, breastfeed your child. So even after treatment, cancer survivors should follow these cancer prevention recommendations. So let's walk through these recommendations as it relates to breast cancer risk. And here I have a table where we're looking at protective factors, so those factors that are associated with a decreased risk of developing breast cancer. And then we have those that are associated with an increased risk of developing breast cancer that range between 1 and 2 to more than 2. And in general, what we see is that reproductive patterns, which are represented in pink, are consistent but still fairly modest risk factors, as they generally confer a risk that is less than 1.5 times the average person's risk. This is in contrast to our much stronger risk factors, such as family history, benign breast disease, having a high density within your breast or high mammographic density, a personal history of breast cancer, and radiation. Now, over the past couple of decades, when we think about reproductive risk factors, they're generally non-modifiable except for possibly breastfeeding. And this is what has left breast cancer prevention more elusive than other cancers such as lung cancer. But we have now understood some of the roles that make more progress in breast cancer prevention, such as chemo prevention and exogenous hormone use, which are been associated with both preventing and causing, and these factors are highlighted in blue. But today we want to focus on those factors that are modifiable, that are non-medication lifestyle factors, which are highlighted in red, such as physical activity, body size, and alcohol. These have been a focus in breast cancer prevention as they are modifiable and they do not involve some of the same side effects as medication would. So the American Cancer Society, in conjunction with the American Society of Clinical Oncology, which is ASCO, has some guidelines for breast cancer survivorship. And in general, it is the same as the American Institute of Cancer Research, which is maintaining a healthy weight, staying physically active, having a healthy diet, and not smoking. Now, the levels of evidence for these in promoting better breast cancer outcomes ranges. Some of the evidence is quite weak and some of it is quite strong. And what I want to do is take you through to understand some of the evidence that we have regarding these factors. So first, let's talk about being as lean as possible or just maintaining a healthy weight. That is one way of making sure that you have better breast cancer outcomes. Evidence suggests that there is a very strong link between having a healthy BMI or a body mass index before and after a diagnosis, and it also attributes to having a successful outcomes for survival. So first, I want to orient you to how are we really viewing this evidence? How are researchers coming up with these recommendations? And to visualize the evidence, we often look at a meta-analysis. So this is a meta-analysis of looking at body fat before a breast cancer diagnosis and the risk of mortality. And we know through a meta-analysis, this is a statistical approach that combines multiple studies. So not just one study that might have found a weak effect or a modest association. This is looking at the entire body of evidence around a particular risk factor and asking, is it really associated with the outcome? Which makes a stronger assumption for its impact on health outcomes. So this particular study is looking at a meta-analysis where we look at body fat per 5 units of BMI. So it's saying, for example, if we look at the first study by the author Conroy in 2011, we have an estimate, which is in green, that is far right of the 1. So pretty much anything that falls on 1 means there's no effect, meaning there's no association. There's no true evidence to support that this particular factor is associated with mortality or a second breast cancer recurrence or whatever the outcome you're looking at. And so since we see that it's far right of the 1, this is a strong finding. This is suggesting that for every 5 units of BMI, there's a 1.29 or 29% increased risk of mortality. But if you look at the second study, its evidence is much weaker. If we look at Liu from 2011, it's not as strong of a finding. But what's important here is to look at the pink diamond. This is the take-home point. And this take-home point is saying, with the preponderance of evidence, looking at the evidence overall from 1994 to 2011, all these studies with all of these women are suggesting that there is, in fact, body fat before breast cancer diagnosis does impact in a negative way mortality. So we also look at this by body fat after a breast cancer diagnosis, and we see the same thing, which is we focus on the pink diamond, which is the overall effect that we see. Body fat is also associated after a breast cancer diagnosis with mortality. And then we also want to know about a secondary breast cancer outcome. So this is having a secondary diagnosis of breast cancer, or whether it be new or a recurrence. And this is saying that body fat after a breast cancer diagnosis, so how much you weigh after your diagnosis, is also associated with having a secondary breast cancer diagnosis. So this evidence is pretty strong, suggesting that the maintaining of a healthy weight is very critical to outcomes. But the question becomes, what about weight gain? So you can be a certain weight prior to your diagnosis and then lose weight or gain weight after your diagnosis for many reasons. And so this particular study was fairly recently done, and this looks at weight gain after a breast cancer diagnosis. And so for the first group at 2.11, this is looking at moderate weight gain. So this is looking at individuals across a series of studies that gained no more than 5 to 10% after a breast cancer diagnosis. So this is pre-diagnosis and post-diagnosis. And really, if you look at the black triangle, which is a summation of all the evidence that is out there, it doesn't seem to be a strong effect, which suggests that a moderate weight gain is not too risky and is not associated with mortality. But in contrast, a high weight gain, which is in the second grouping, is associated with mortality, strongly so, suggesting that gaining more than 10% after a breast cancer diagnosis would be associated with mortality. So we want to maintain a healthy weight after a breast cancer diagnosis. But how do we do that? And so most studies have suggested through physical activity. So evidence shows that women who are physically active, both before and after a diagnosis, have a much greater chance of surviving breast cancer. And there's several, the World Cancer Research Fund recommends that it's at least 30 minutes every day of being physically active. And what's interesting is that this is from a variety of mechanisms. So being physically active actually impacts not just the reduction of your body fat so that you can maintain a healthy weight, it also enhances your antioxidant defense. And what this means is that it helps prevent, or it helps give the antioxidant defense, which helps genes repair themselves. So it helps prevent mutations in your genes. It decreases in reproductive hormones, as we know that endogenous and exogenous hormones are associated with increased breast cancer risk. And it enhances your immunity. And an enhanced immunity is able to check any cells that may be deleterious or in danger of causing inflammation, or also suppressing any negative effects that inflammation can cause within your body, because we know that inflammation is associated with increased breast cancer risk. It also results in a change in insulin resistance and what we call the IGF-1 pathway, as insulin resistance and this pathway is associated with increased risk. So physical activity works in a variety of ways, not just by helping you maintain your body fat, but by overall giving your body increased defenses to cancer. Another way of maintaining a healthy weight is diet and nutrition. So good nutrition has been associated with reducing the incidence of breast cancer, but also reducing the risk of breast cancer progression and recurrence. And there's a number of factors that go into a good diet and nutrition. The World Cancer Research Fund suggests, the limited consumption of energy-dense foods, so it's just foods that are high in fats or added sugars, and so avoiding those sugary drinks, eating more of a variety of vegetables, fruits, whole grains, and beans, but also limiting the consumption of processed meats and red meats, limiting the consumption of salty foods, foods processed with salt, and not using supplements to protect against cancer. But what I'd like to focus on is something that has been established as one of the strongest modifiable behaviors for breast cancer prevention, and that's alcohol. So alcohol intake has been associated with an increase in breast cancer risk across a multitude of studies. We did a review article where we looked at alcohol intake and breast cancer risk, weighing the overall evidence, and pretty much found that if you look at the preponderance of the evidence that exists, light alcohol intake as well as moderate alcohol intake is all associated with an increase in breast cancer risk. But it's also associated with breast cancer risk factors, as we know that mammographic breast density is considered one of the strongest risk factors for developing breast cancer, as a greater density in one's breast is associated with greater risk of breast cancer, and a greater amount of alcohol intake is also associated with increasing breast density. Therefore, I want to first take you on understanding what is alcohol intake and what does it look like to impact your risk. So to look at alcohol intake 101, we first have to really understand what is a standard drink. So when we think about research, we as researchers think that a standard drink contains roughly 14 grams of pure alcohol. But that is looking at like 1 12 full ounce of regular beer, a cup of malt liquor that is about 8 to 9 fluid ounces, 5 full ounces of table wine, and about 1.5 ounces of a shot of hard liquor like whiskey or tequila, etc. But what's to note here is that this is how we as researchers quantify alcohol intake. we know that based off of asking people about their alcohol intake that we underestimate, mainly because people, when they report their alcohol use, are vastly underestimating, at least by 50%, how much alcohol they really intake or how much they consume, because no one really knows, like, what's a 5 full ounce of table wine? There could be a heavy pour, or having a beer that's actually larger than 12 full ounces, but they would still consider that one beer, or having a drink that is a multitude of vodka and another hard liquor, which therefore actually counts as 2 servings of alcohol. But in general, when we do this, we know that we're underestimating, but we do categorize those drinkers as low-risk drinkers and at-risk drinkers. And we say that for women, consuming 7 drinks or less per week is associated with low risk drinking. So this is considered your light or your moderate drinker. But drinking more than 7 drinks per week is considered a heavy drinker. So when we look at our evidence, it is really a dose relationship, meaning the more you drink, the higher your risk of developing breast cancer. This is looking at a collaborative reanalysis of 53 studies that includes 58,000 plus women with breast cancer and 95 plus thousand women without the disease. And what we have on the y-axis is your relative risk, or your risk of developing breast cancer. And on the bottom axis, in the parentheses, is the number of drinks one has on a daily basis. And so it goes from having no drinks to having 6 drinks per day. And you can see with this linear relationship, this rise in this slope, that the more drinks a woman consumes, the higher their breast cancer risk. And one may think like, oh, well, just drinking 6 drinks per week, of course, you're going to increase your breast cancer risk. But I want you to note that right near those who never drink, even slight drinking, even light drinking, so drinking less than 1 drink per day, is associated with an increased risk of breast cancer. So what does this look like for breast cancer survivors? Well, some findings suggest that breast cancer survivors who drink alcohol after a diagnosis have an increased risk of recurrence and breast cancer mortality. However, in contrast, other studies have shown that there's no difference in recurrence, such that there's no difference in a second diagnosis of breast cancer, and there's no difference in breast cancer mortality between survivors who drink less than 1 drink a day versus survivors who don't drink at all. But what is very clear across all health outcomes is that excessive alcohol drinking has 0 health benefits, only health risk. But I do want to explore this notion of alcohol intake after diagnosis. So this is a meta-analysis that the World Cancer Research Foundation did in looking at survival and second breast cancer diagnosis. So this, what I'm showing you, is looking at a dose response, so like the linear relationship I showed you for drinking like per 1 drink per week. So this is looking at after a breast cancer diagnosis. So drinking out after a breast cancer diagnosis and having a recurrence or a second new cancer being diagnosed as breast cancer. And what we see here is that all of the studies that have assessed this are pretty much straddling no association. So pretty much they're all straddling the 1, which means that no study has shown a very strong association. And overall, if we look at the diamond, there is an association, but it's very low at 1.01, which means that it's less than, it's about 1% of an increased risk. We also did this and looked in the breast cancer family registry. So I want to pause and just note that many women who are diagnosed with breast cancer actually have a breast cancer family history. And a lot of the evidence that we provide showcases preventing breast cancer for the general population. But it's very imperative that those with a breast cancer family history also know guidelines for preventing a primary as well as a second diagnosis of breast cancer, as well as mortality. And so the Breast Cancer Family Registry is a prospective study that has been going on that recruited clinic-based patients, so patients that had a breast cancer diagnosis, but also their family members. So everyone that enters the registry enters as a family. And so we have 3 clinic-based sites and 3 population-based sites. So you can imagine that the clinic-based sites are cases that probably are from high risk, whereas population-based sites come from cancer registries, and they are more representative of your average population level risk. And follow-up started for this registry in 2007 and recently had an update in 2011 and is also currently being updated now. So there's a lot of evidence about their about their behaviors from when they first were diagnosed, as well as we asked them retrospectively about behaviors prior to diagnosis. And one of the questions we asked them was alcohol intake. And so we looked at lifetime alcohol intake. And in general, we're finding what we found in the general population, that even in a high-risk population, we're not seeing a strong association between lifetime alcohol intake or alcohol intake and breast cancer mortality. So to orient you through this table, we're looking at overall mortality, breast cancer specific mortality, this is all in the left-hand column, and non-breast cancer mortality. And we compare our drinkers to non-drinkers. And we looked at drinkers that we considered light drinkers, which is 3 drinks or less, or our moderate to heavy drinkers, which are more than 3 drinks per week. And in general, we found a non-significant increase in mortality for consuming more than 3 drinks per week in this high-risk cohort. So suggesting, as we see in the general population, that maybe drinking, and this lifetime alcohol is from age 12 and to when they were asked at follow-up. So then we asked the question, well, for a high-risk cohort, does the age at which the amount that you've been drinking, does that impact your risk? And so this looks at lifetime alcohol intake and breast cancer mortality by age, where the triangles are representing your light drinkers and your squares are representing your moderate to heavy drinkers. And we're looking at those women who has a lifetime alcohol intake and they're under 50 years compared to those that are 50 to 64 years versus those that are 65 years old or older. And what's interesting here is that you start seeing this trend where it seems like the older age you are, because we're looking at the 1 line, so when an estimate falls above the 1, there's this increased risk. Though it's not strong, it's not significant, we are seeing that the older age you are, so the more lifetime alcohol intake you've had, you are more likely to have a increase in overall mortality. And this was also seen for non-breast cancer mortality, but even more so where those who are 65 years old and older and are drinking more than 3 drinks per week, when we average out across their lifetime, they actually have a more than twofold increased risk of mortality. So this suggests that some of the studies that we've been looking at for alcohol may need to be looked at specifically related to different factors like by age or even by race ethnicity. But we would have to have those cohorts and those prospective data to be able to follow that. But this does suggest that, yes, alcohol intake in this high-risk cohort is associated with breast cancer mortality if we're considering by age. And if it's associated with a high-risk group by age, then it's very possible that for the general population, it would be too. So in summary, because I wanted to leave ample time for questions, the risk of breast cancer is modifiable for primary as well as secondary diagnosis as well as mortality. Pretty much maintaining a healthy body weight is something that one can do. It's modifiable through physical activity or through diet and nutrition. So these are things that one has control over after a breast cancer diagnosis for decreasing their chance of mortality and decreasing their risk of a secondary diagnosis. I think that even though the evidence is very weak in this area, it is suggested and recommended that consuming alcohol can increase your risk of breast cancer, even after a diagnosis. So limiting the consumption is very critical for preventing recurrence as well as mortality. And I wanted to just give some of the online resources that I feel that are giving similar dialogue in relation to how to reduce some of the survival outcomes like mortality and recurrence, and how to reduce the incidence of those within survivors. And lastly, I want to thank you for your time and for listening and for logging in, and take any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Dr. McDonald. That was a great presentation. So we have a couple of questions that people submitted before the presentation. So when people registered, they submitted some questions that we'll ask, and a couple of questions that come in now. And there's still time to ask your questions. So if you go to your control panel under questions, you could type a question in there, and I will be happy to ask it to Dr. McDonald. So one question is, in the slides, you said that not to use supplements to prevent cancer. Can you talk about that a little more? Which supplements to avoid, or, you know, a lot of people take different supplements for thinking that it might help prevent cancer diagnosis, like vitamin D or vitamin C. So can you talk about that?
Well, generally, I feel that what we're trying to promote when we say do not use supplements to prevent against cancer is that they can be used as supplement to maybe nutrition. If you are low in vitamin D, if you're not getting a lot of vitamin C, but they're not to be used for cancer prevention. One reason for this is that there's a lot of factors that go into nutrition. So when we think about, when we're talking about diet and nutrition, and we talk about eating a healthy diet and limiting sugary beverages, that particular diet recommendation impacts on several different pathways. Like when we're talking about physical activity, it doesn't just embark on one particular pathway that's going to prevent cancer. It embarks on several different pathways in very different ways to prevent your risk of breast cancer. And it's important to think of supplements as just that. They're just supplements. They're not going to give you the overall benefit that's needed from some of these larger prevention strategies that are being promoted. And there's not enough evidence long-term to really suggest that supplements especially because no supplement is made equal. So to actually recommend a supplement that would reduce cancer risk would mean that we would have a study where everyone has been using the same type of supplements with the same type of ingredients for the same amount of time. That's just not really out there in our evidence to support that it would reduce cancer. So we look at these prevention methods as those that are more tried and true and can impact on multiple avenues.
Thank you. Another question, can you speak to any external environmental factors like in the air or water that may impact risk?
Yes, so there's been a lot of studies on exogenous hormones that are contributed from like health products that you may use, such as like shampoos and conditioners, so BPA from water bottles, etc. And these are called endocrine disrupting chemicals. And endocrine disrupting chemicals range from being phthalates, which are commonly found in perfumes, BPA, which is commonly found in water bottles. There's also something known as PBDE, which is actually found in like furniture to make it flame retardant, so to prevent it if there is a fire from actually going up in flames. And it's common in a lot of furniture. It's highly prevalent in California. But it's been, all of these have been, so from phthalates to PBDs to the BPAs, you have seen different, advertisements, BPA free, phthalate free, et cetera, et cetera. And it's because it's been suggested as a probable or a possible carcinogen. And the reason that it works as a carcinogen is because it's supplying either extra hormones exogenously, and we know that an increase in certain hormones is associated with breast cancer risk. So it is always preferable to try to use natural, but I will say that the concern here is that sometimes you may see a product and it says it's phthalate free, it's BPA free, and all of these other things. And so we as researchers are trying to keep up with, okay, so what substitute chemical might have been used instead of phthalates or instead of BPA in this particular product. And so we've been looking at that, but mainly I would say it's endocrine disrupting chemicals. There's also polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons that are known as PAHs. And this is commonly found in the air, and they're highly ubiquitous. And so you can imagine that they're found in grilling, like they're a combustible product. So it happens when things combust. So let's say that you live by a highway. So the exhaust fumes will have PAHs. Let's say you grill food. Grilled food would expose you to PAHs. And PAHs are one of the only truly affirmed carcinogen that has been associated with breast cancer. There have been studies that shown that foggers that were used in like the 1950s, where they were blowing them out of the trucks to help with pesticide control, and they were pretty much spraying DDT and DDE. And the Long Island breast cancer study has shown that these pesticides are associated with increased breast cancer risk. And that high levels of pesticides are associated with high breast cancer risk. So PAHs as well as DDTs and DDEs, these have been associated with your exposure through the air and through the food with breast cancer risk.
So then another question which is related, does living around like an oil refinery or an airport or a landfill have an effect on the occurrence of breast cancer? And can you point to any related research?
Well, so I would say that there's been studies, and off the top of my head, they've been more of like the Long Island breast cancer study. That was something where they noted that there was a very high prevalence of breast cancer within that population compared to the rest of the U.S. And all of those studies is the LIBSCP, Long Island Breast Cancer Study Project. And they were actually exposed to high amounts of pesticides. So that's one study that has shown like environmental exposures. There's been another recent study that has looked at living near a highway and living near a lot of traffic. This was based, but unfortunately, this was mainly looking at the risks of developing breast cancer and not breast cancer itself. This was pretty much saying that airport pollution, traffic pollution, all of that is associated with increasing your risk of breast cancer. But they were mainly looking at intermediate outcomes to breast cancer. And there's also there's a New England family study, and there's a study that looks at DDT and DDE, but that's mainly based off of prenatal exposures. So I can't really recall offhand studies for like refineries or airports, like specific in that nature, and cancer. But that's mainly because cancer has a very long latency period. And so those studies would be mainly retrospective in design, such that like the Long Island breast cancer study, you notice that there's a high rate of cancer in this population. And then you ask them what their exposures were and what they lived next to. But there haven't been studies necessarily that said, okay, people living in these regions or these areas specifically, let's look at their breast cancer outcomes later. But I would say that based off of combustibles, which produces polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons or PAHs, living near airports, living near refineries or traffic, they also spew out small particles that have been associated with breast cancer. So in general, I would say the more exposure you have to those particular type of annelids, your risk would be increased. Your lifetime risk.
So someone is asking, how long is the latency period typically? So from exposure to the development of disease?
So it can be anywhere from 40 years, really. Because if we think about windows of susceptibility for breast cancer, we mainly think of these time periods where the breast tissue is highly vulnerable to environmental exposures that are carcinogenic. And these windows of time include the prenatal period, it includes the pubertal period, it includes the postpartum period, and right before menopause. And so if we think about the accumulation of mutations that it takes to actually propagate cancer, latency period is about 40 years or more. Now, if you're thinking about exposures like radiation, breast cancer family history, like these increase your risk so much higher, or genetic risk. That's a little bit different. But if we're talking about environmental exposures and the time period when you are exposed to that environmental exposure, it takes a very long period of time for that to manifest into breast cancer. So I guess I would think about it in this way. Consider a woman who is at average population level risk. They have no genetic factors that are associated with their increased risk of developing cancer. And then let's say that during puberty, they live near a highly trafficked area and they're more highly exposed to different environmental carcinogens that cause a slight mutation in a particular gene. And then that girl goes on and maybe during the postpartum period where her breasts are rapidly dividing, she finds herself exposed to polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or like she's consuming a lot of grilled meats. And so she has another hit that is mutagenic. And then over time, the control of that cell that has become mutagenic is uncontrollable, and she develops cancer. But it's well after her having children, and maybe she develops cancer like in her 60s. So about 40 years after if she had her child at 20 or so. In contrast, we have to think about those who are at increased risk of developing breast cancer because they have a higher risk due to maybe they have a BRCA1, BRCA2 mutation, or they have a first or second degree family relative that developed breast cancer fairly early. That individual actually may have an underlying genetic susceptibility that they may in fact develop breast cancer. If the latency period may actually be truncated because they're already susceptible to having environmental exposures mutate their gene. And so they actually may develop cancer in 20 years from their pregnancy versus the person who developed it 40 years that did not have an underlying genetic susceptibility. So part of the research of today is really understanding those who are at high risk due to underlying susceptibility and looking at factors that contribute to them developing cancer, as well as the general population.
Thank you. So, on the helpline at Share, we get lots of calls from people who are newly diagnosed or are dealing with a recurrence, and often they blame themselves. And so just today, actually, we had 2 phone calls, one from someone who's newly diagnosed, who was blaming herself that maybe she didn't eat well enough, or maybe she didn't exercise enough. And then a woman in her 80s who had breast cancer and totally changed her diet, doesn't eat red meat, exercises for 30 minutes every single day, and was, saying that, well, I've done everything that I've been told to do, and it still came back. And so, we're left with having to talk to someone about, about this sort of dilemma, right? And about blaming themselves, and we always try to point to the fact that there are people who just we randomly get breast cancer and we don't really know why, right? There could be reasons that could maybe be traced back to something, but it seems to be very random in many cases, right? Or there are people that do the exact same thing that you do and they don't get cancer. Right. So I guess the question is, when people, how can we better talk to people about trying to, reduce the risk of recurrence or trying to prevent, but also, not blaming them for getting a diagnosis of cancer?
Well, and that's why I feel like it's important to understand that it's not just one thing that can contribute to the development of breast cancer. I mean, your individual behavior is only so much of your risk of developing breast cancer. So literally, you can do everything right, from your diet to your physical activity to your body size to your drinking behaviors. But you can't necessarily control if you have dense breasts. You can't necessarily control if you inherit small risk due to your genes. Like, it doesn't have to be BRCA1 or BRCA2. We now have a host of like 300 plus small nucleotide proteins that are associated with increased risk of breast cancer. You can't necessarily control if you live in an environment where the healthiest, the closest access to healthy food is very far away. So you're going to the corner market. I mean, there's only so much one can do, and it's not just on that individual. So I say that, the risk of breast cancer is one of those things that, yes, you can do everything right and you are reducing your risk. You're not eliminating your risk because there's other factors outside of your control.
That's very helpful. Thank you. So people want to know, should they be using the microwave? Does that increase any kind of risk, or just?
No, there hasn't been an association with like microwaves or underwire bras or deodorant or things of that nature. If anything, we're thinking mainly about processed foods. So, a lot of the things that go in the microwave, like those ready-made dinners, they have like, they're high in salt. They may have processed meats. So you just want to stay away from things like that. So I wouldn't say the microwave's the enemy, but what are you putting in the microwave may be more something that needs to be taken into account.
Right, that makes sense. Okay. And then, should people be drinking? Someone's asking, are there, any benefits to drinking a filtered water as opposed to distilled water, or just regular tap water or bottled water?
Not necessarily. The only reason that would be the case is if you knew that your water had a higher lead, and it's mainly because lead is just in general unhealthy, not necessarily as it relates to breast cancer. But there's no true, I would say, benefit of like drinking filtered water and reducing your breast cancer risk. But if you know your water has a higher concentration of certain contaminants, then I think you should reduce the consumption of your unfiltered water intake just for other health benefits, but not necessarily because it's going to impact your breast cancer risk,
Right.
especially for children.
Okay. And then people want to know, is there any, other than the things that you mentioned, the processed food, salty foods, you know, meats, maybe grilled meats, any other foods that should be avoided, and what about sugar?
So you definitely want to avoid a lot of sugar, and in general, like what people have suggested. And I think this is just naturally based off of like, if you have a diet that's high in fruits and vegetables and whole grains with low sugar, low salt, all of that is working on multiple pathways. So it's not just that it's good for you, it's also, for example, a low inflammatory diet. So there's been suggestions that some of these, like the processed meats, the red meat, all of that can contribute to more inflammation. And cancer is an inflammatory disease. So you do want to decrease internal inflammation. So just eating a diet that, contributes to that is what the goal is. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to only drink turmeric tea, but that just means that when you're making your diet choices, you just in general, you stick to less salty foods, less sugary foods, make whole grains your choice, less, because some of the grains that you may choose are more processed. So you want to use whole grains instead of processed grains. So that's really what we're thinking about in order to reduce inflammation. And that's the same thing as stress. Like you want to reduce your stress to decrease inflammation. Yeah.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing up stress. That was my next and last question, but I think that you covered it. So thank you so much, Dr. McDonald. That was a great program, and I've learned a lot, and I hope that everyone else has as well. Everyone, thank you for participating. If you wouldn't mind just taking a moment to fill out the survey at the end of the webinar, that really helps us in developing programs that meet your needs. Thanks so much, Dr. McDonald. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, you too. Thanks, everyone.